Captain Marcus Rodriguez had always believed that rank meant everything in the military. At 32, he wore his bars with pride, never missing a chance to remind everyone around him that he was in charge. His perfectly pressed uniform, polished boots, and commanding voice had earned him respect from most of his subordinates. But there was one man who never seemed impressed by the captain's authority: Sergeant First Class Daniel "Silent Dan" Morrison. Morrison was a different breed of soldier. At 45, he had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. His weathered face told stories that no military report could capture. Scars ran across his left cheek from an IED blast in Kandahar, and his eyes held the kind of wisdom that only came from surviving the impossible. While other soldiers called him Silent Dan because of his quiet nature, those who knew him well understood that his silence was not weakness. It was calculation. The trouble between Rodriguez and Morrison began on a rainy Tuesday morning at Fort Braxton. The captain had just received orders to lead a special training exercise called Operation Desert Storm, a week-long simulation designed to test the unit's combat readiness. Rodriguez saw this as his chance to prove himself worthy of promotion to major. He had studied every manual, memorized every protocol, and planned every detail of the operation. Morrison, however, had different ideas about how things should be done. "Sergeant Morrison!" Rodriguez called out during the morning briefing, his voice echoing through the barracks. "I want you to understand that this exercise will be conducted exactly according to regulation. No improvisation, no shortcuts, and absolutely no questioning of orders." Morrison stood at attention, his gray eyes meeting the captain's stare without flinching. "Yes, sir," he replied simply. But Rodriguez could sense something beneath those words. A challenge, perhaps, or maybe just experience speaking to inexperience. The first day of the exercise went smoothly enough. Rodriguez's carefully planned maneuvers unfolded exactly as written in the textbooks. His soldiers moved through the desert terrain with precision, following every order to the letter. But Morrison remained quiet, observing everything with the patience of a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Rodriguez noticed Morrison's silence and mistook it for submission. He began to push harder, issuing increasingly complex orders designed to showcase his tactical brilliance. He split the unit into smaller groups, assigned impossible time frames for objectives, and demanded perfect execution of maneuvers that even seasoned veterans would find challenging. "You see, Morrison," Rodriguez said during a brief rest stop, pulling the sergeant aside, "this is how real leadership works. Not the cowboy tactics you might be used to from your overseas deployments. This is about discipline, order, and following the chain of command." Morrison simply nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. "Understood, sir." What Rodriguez didn't know was that Morrison had been quietly taking notes, not about the exercise itself, but about the captain's leadership style. He observed how Rodriguez treated the younger soldiers, how he made decisions under pressure, and most importantly, how his ego seemed to grow larger with each successful maneuver. On the second day, things began to change. The weather turned harsh, with sandstorms reducing visibility to mere feet. Radio communications became spotty, and the carefully planned timeline started falling apart. Rodriguez, determined to stick to his original plan, refused to adapt to the changing conditions. "Sir," Morrison approached the captain during a particularly fierce sandstorm, "the weather's getting worse. Maybe we should consider modifying the route or waiting for better visibility." Rodriguez's face reddened with anger. "Sergeant, I don't recall asking for your opinion. We stick to the plan no matter what. That's what separates good soldiers from great ones, the ability to execute orders regardless of circumstances." Morrison stepped back, but his eyes never left the captain's face. "Copy that, sir." As the storm intensified, Rodriguez's stubbornness began to cost them. 2 soldiers got separated from their unit and had to be rescued by a search team. Equipment failures mounted as sand infiltrated sensitive electronics. The exercise that was supposed to showcase Rodriguez's leadership skills was turning into a disaster. But Morrison remained patient, watching and waiting. He helped the struggling soldiers without being asked, shared his water with those who had miscalculated their supplies, and quietly guided lost team members back to safety. He did all of this without saying a word to Rodriguez, never undermining the captain's authority, but always ensuring that no soldier was left behind. By the third day, word had spread through the ranks about Morrison's quiet heroics. Soldiers began looking to him for guidance rather than waiting for Rodriguez's increasingly frantic orders. The captain noticed the shift, but misunderstood its cause. "I see what's happening here, Morrison," Rodriguez confronted him after another difficult day. "You're trying to undermine my authority. You think because you've been deployed a few times you know better than an officer with formal military education." Morrison's response was calm and measured. "Sir, I'm just trying to help ensure the mission's success and keep our people safe." "Don't give me that humble act," Rodriguez snapped. "I know what you're doing. You're building loyalty among the troops so you can make me look bad. But I've got news for you, Sergeant. I didn't get these bars by accident, and I sure as hell won't let some old warhorse show me up." That night, Rodriguez made a decision that would prove to be his downfall. He decided to give Morrison a task so impossible, so dangerous, and so likely to fail that it would finally put the veteran in his place. He called it Silencio 7, a solo reconnaissance mission deep into enemy territory with minimal equipment and no backup support. Rodriguez spent hours designing the mission, making it as challenging as possible while still maintaining plausible deniability if things went wrong. Morrison would have to navigate 30 miles of hostile terrain, gather intelligence on enemy positions, and return within 12 hours, all while maintaining radio silence except for emergency situations. The captain smiled to himself as he finalized the mission parameters. This would be Morrison's breaking point. The veteran would either fail spectacularly, proving that experience was no match for proper military education, or he would be forced to request assistance, finally admitting that Rodriguez's leadership was superior. What Rodriguez didn't realize was that Morrison had been preparing for exactly this kind of challenge his entire military career. The veteran had survived impossible odds before, and he had learned that the most dangerous enemy was often the one wearing the same uniform. As Morrison received his mission briefing the next morning, his expression remained unchanged. He listened to every detail, asked no questions, and simply nodded when Rodriguez finished speaking. "Any concerns with Sergeant?" Rodriguez asked with a smug smile. "No, sir," Morrison replied quietly. "I understand the mission." "Good. Remember, radio silence unless it's an absolute emergency. I want to see what you're really made of out there." Morrison gathered his minimal equipment: a rifle, basic ammunition, water for 12 hours, a map, and a radio he was forbidden to use except in life-or-death situations. As he prepared to leave, several soldiers approached him with worried expressions. "Sarge, this mission is crazy," whispered Private Johnson. "The captain's sending you out there alone against a full enemy squad with nothing but basic gear." Morrison placed a reassuring hand on the young soldier's shoulder. "Don't worry about me, son. I've been in tighter spots than this. Just focus on your own mission and trust that everything will work out." As Morrison disappeared into the desert landscape, Rodriguez watched through his binoculars with satisfaction. Finally, he would prove that proper military protocol was superior to whatever reputation Morrison had built through his battlefield experiences. But Rodriguez had made a critical error in judgment. He had assumed that Morrison's quiet nature meant submission, that his willingness to follow orders indicated weakness, and that his years of combat experience were somehow less valuable than a military academy education. The captain was about to learn that some lessons could only be taught by those who had survived them, and that underestimating a veteran like Morrison was the kind of mistake that could end a military career. As the sun began to set on that third day of the exercise, Rodriguez sat in his command tent, confident that he had finally put Morrison in his place. He had no idea that Silencio 7 was about to become the most important lesson of his military career, one that would teach him the difference between leadership and authority, between commanding respect and earning it, and between following the book and understanding the human cost of every decision. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the outcome of the exercise, but the future of both men's military careers. The desert was unforgiving as Morrison moved through the darkness, his boots making barely a whisper against the sand. Years of combat had taught him how to become one with the terrain, how to read the landscape like a book written in shadows and silence. While Rodriguez sat in his comfortable command tent, believing he had sent Morrison on an impossible mission, the veteran was already proving why experience trumped textbook knowledge every time. Morrison had studied the mission parameters carefully, noting every detail that Rodriguez thought would trap him. The captain had chosen the most difficult route possible, positioned enemy forces at strategic choke points, and limited Morrison's resources to what he considered the bare minimum. But Rodriguez had made his first mistake. He had planned the mission like a classroom exercise rather than real combat. What the captain didn't understand was that Morrison had faced genuine life-or-death situations where failure meant not just embarrassment, but death. In Afghanistan, he had once spent 4 days behind enemy lines with nothing but a knife, and his wits after his squad was ambushed. In Iraq, he had single-handedly rescued 3 wounded soldiers from a collapsed building while under heavy fire. These experiences had taught him that survival wasn't about having the perfect equipment or following the perfect plan. It was about adaptation, patience, and understanding your enemy better than they understood themselves. As Morrison approached the first checkpoint, he could see the enemy soldiers positioned exactly where Rodriguez had placed them. They were good soldiers, following their orders to create a realistic training scenario, but they were thinking like soldiers in an exercise rather than soldiers in combat. Morrison, however, was thinking like a soldier whose life depended on every decision. Instead of attempting the direct approach that Rodriguez expected him to take, Morrison spent 2 hours observing the enemy positions. He watched their patrol patterns, noted when they checked their watches, and identified the exact moment when their attention would be focused elsewhere. Rodriguez had given the enemy soldiers specific times to rotate positions, creating a window of exactly 4 minutes when the eastern approach would be unguarded. Morrison waited patiently for that window, then moved through the gap like a ghost. By the time the enemy soldiers returned to their positions, he was already past them and moving toward the next objective. The first phase of Silencio 7 was complete, and Rodriguez's carefully planned trap had been neutralized through simple observation and patience. Back at the command post, Rodriguez was monitoring radio chatter from the exercise controllers. So far, there had been no reports of Morrison being spotted or captured. The captain assumed this meant Morrison was moving slowly, probably struggling with the difficult terrain and limited resources. "Any word from Sergeant Morrison?" Rodriguez asked his communications officer. "No, sir. Complete radio silence as ordered." Rodriguez smiled. "Good. He's probably realizing right about now that this mission is beyond his capabilities. Give it another few hours, and he'll be calling for backup." What Rodriguez didn't know was that Morrison was already approaching the main objective, a fortified position that the captain had designed to be nearly impregnable. The enemy had established overlapping fields of fire, motion sensors, and a patrol schedule that seemed to cover every possible approach route. Rodriguez had spent hours perfecting this particular challenge, convinced that it would force Morrison to either fail or break radio silence to request assistance. Morrison studied the fortified position from a concealed observation post he had established on a small ridge overlooking the target. He could see that Rodriguez had indeed created a formidable challenge, But the captain had made several critical errors that only someone with real combat experience would recognize. First, Rodriguez had positioned the defenses to look impressive rather than to be tactically sound. The overlapping fields of fire created dead zones that could be exploited by someone who understood how to read terrain. Second, the patrol schedule was too predictable, exactly the kind of mistake that got soldiers killed in real combat. And third, the motion sensors had been placed to detect movement along the obvious approach routes, but Morrison had no intention of taking an obvious route. Morrison spent the next 3 hours mapping every detail of the defensive position. He identified the guard rotation schedule down to the minute, located the power source for the motion sensors, and discovered a drainage culvert that Rodriguez had overlooked in his planning. The captain had focused so much on creating an impressive defensive position that he had forgotten one of the most basic rules of military engineering. Every fortification has a weakness. As dawn approached, Morrison made his move. He used the drainage culvert to approach within 50 feet of the main objective, timing his advance to coincide with the guard rotation. When the motion sensor network briefly reset during its automatic maintenance cycle, Morrison slipped through the perimeter and gathered the intelligence he had been sent to collect. The irony was not lost on Morrison that Rodriguez had made the mission more difficult than necessary by overthinking it. A simpler, more realistic defensive position would have been much harder to penetrate than the elaborate setup the captain had created to showcase his tactical knowledge. With the primary objective complete, Morrison began his return journey, but instead of simply heading back to base, he decided to complete an additional task that Rodriguez had not assigned, something that would demonstrate the true difference between textbook leadership and battlefield wisdom. During his reconnaissance, Morrison had noticed that the exercise scenario placed several wounded soldiers in positions where they would be difficult to rescue using conventional tactics. Rodriguez had designed these scenarios to test the other unit's ability to follow medical evacuation procedures, but Morrison realized that the captain's by-the-book approach would result in unnecessarily high casualty rates in a real combat situation. Morrison spent the next several hours moving between these wounded soldier positions, not to interfere with the other unit's training, but to identify tactical solutions that could save lives. He documented alternative approach routes, cover positions that weren't marked on the standard maps, and timing patterns that could be exploited to conduct safer evacuations. This wasn't part of his mission, and Rodriguez would never know about it unless Morrison chose to share the information. But for Morrison, taking care of soldiers wasn't about following orders or impressing superiors. It was about the responsibility that came with experience and the knowledge that every tactical decision affected real people's lives. As the 12-hour deadline approached, Morrison was already within sight of the base camp. He had completed his mission with hours to spare, gathered intelligence that exceeded the original requirements, and identified tactical improvements that could benefit future operations. But he chose to wait until exactly the 12-hour mark before approaching the perimeter. Rodriguez was pacing nervously in his command tent when the communications officer announced Morrison's return. "Sir, Sergeant Morrison is requesting permission to enter the perimeter." Rodriguez's face showed a mixture of disappointment and confusion. He had been so certain that Morrison would fail or break radio silence that the veteran's successful completion of the mission caught him completely off guard. "Are you sure it's him?" Rodriguez asked. "He completed the entire mission?" "Yes, sir. He's carrying the intelligence materials you requested and appears to be in good condition." Rodriguez stepped outside his tent as Morrison approached. The veteran looked tired but not defeated, dirty but not broken. He carried himself with the same quiet confidence he had shown before the mission, as if completing an impossible task was just another day's work. "Sergeant Morrison reporting completion of Silencio 7, Morrison said simply, handing over the intelligence materials. Rodriguez examined the documents with growing amazement. Not only had Morrison gathered all the required intelligence, but he had done it with a thoroughness and attention to detail that exceeded military standards. The photographs were clear, the position maps were accurate, and the enemy strength assessments were comprehensive. "How did you—" Rodriguez began, then stopped himself. Asking for details would mean admitting that he had designed the mission to be impossible. "Sir, I completed the mission as ordered," Morrison replied. "Is there anything else you need?" Rodriguez stared at the veteran, trying to understand how Morrison had turned what should have been a humiliating failure into an impressive success. The captain's carefully planned trap had not only failed, but had been executed so flawlessly that it made Rodriguez's tactics look elementary by comparison. "No, Sergeant, that will be all for now." As Morrison walked away, Rodriguez felt something he had never experienced before in his military career: doubt. Not doubt about military regulations or proper procedures, but doubt about his own understanding of what it meant to be a leader. The other soldiers had gathered around Morrison, eager to hear about his mission, but the veteran simply told them it had gone according to plan. He didn't boast about his success or make any comments about the captain's leadership, but Rodriguez could see something in the soldiers' eyes when they looked at Morrison, a respect that went deeper than rank or authority. That night, Rodriguez lay awake in his tent, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what had gone wrong. He had given Morrison an impossible mission designed to prove the veteran's limitations, but instead had only highlighted his own shortcomings as a leader. Rodriguez began to realize that Morrison's quiet nature wasn't submission. It was confidence. The veteran didn't need to prove anything to anyone because his actions spoke louder than words. He didn't challenge authority because he understood that true leadership wasn't about rank or titles, but about earning the trust and respect of those you were responsible for. As the exercise entered its final phase, Rodriguez faced a choice that would define the rest of his military career. He could continue to see Morrison as a threat to his authority and escalate the conflict, or he could recognize that the veteran might have something valuable to teach him. But Rodriguez's pride and ego were not ready to accept that possibility. Instead of learning from Morrison's success, the captain began planning his next move, one that would either establish his dominance once and for all or destroy his career entirely. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would test not just military skills, but the character of both men. Morrison had proven that experience and wisdom could overcome any tactical challenge, but Rodriguez was about to learn that some battles are won or lost not on the battlefield, but in the depths of a leader's heart and mind. The final day of Operation Desert Storm arrived with an ominous tension that every soldier in the unit could feel. Rodriguez had spent the night pacing his tent, consumed by anger and frustration that Morrison had turned his impossible mission into a textbook success. The captain's carefully constructed image of superiority was crumbling, and he knew that word of Morrison's achievement was spreading through the ranks like wildfire. Rodriguez had made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Instead of acknowledging Morrison's skill and learning from it, he chose to double down on his authority. He called an emergency briefing at dawn, assembling the entire unit in the desert sand with the rising sun casting long shadows across their faces. "Soldiers," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying an edge that everyone noticed, "today we conclude Operation Desert Storm with a final exercise that will test everything we've learned this week." Morrison stood with the other soldiers, his expression unreadable as always, but several of the younger troops glanced nervously in his direction. They had heard whispers about the captain's growing obsession with putting the veteran in his place, and they sensed that something significant was about to happen. "This final exercise will be a direct action mission," Rodriguez continued, pulling out a detailed map. "We have intelligence about a high-value target located in a fortified compound approximately 15 miles northeast of our current position. The mission requires speed, precision, and absolute adherence to protocol." Rodriguez's eyes found Morrison in the crowd. Sergeant Morrison, based on your successful completion of yesterday's reconnaissance mission, you'll be leading the assault team. A murmur ran through the gathered soldiers. Leading an assault was typically an officer's responsibility, and everyone understood that Rodriguez was setting Morrison up for something. The captain was essentially saying, "If you think you're so good at impossible missions, let's see how you handle commanding other soldiers under pressure." Morrison stepped forward without hesitation. "Yes, sir." "What are the mission parameters?" Rodriguez smiled coldly. "You'll have 4 soldiers under your command, basic combat load, and exactly 2 hours to reach the objective, neutralize the opposition, secure the target, and return to base. The catch, Sergeant, is that you'll be operating under complete communication blackout. No radio contact with base, no coordination with other units, and no backup if things go wrong." The implications were clear to everyone present. Rodriguez was sending Morrison on a mission where any mistake would be blamed entirely on the veteran's leadership, while any success could be attributed to the captain's overall planning. It was a no-win scenario designed to finally put Morrison in his place, but Rodriguez had made another critical error. In his eagerness to trap Morrison, he had forgotten that the veteran had spent years training young soldiers in combat situations. Morrison didn't just know how to complete impossible missions himself, he knew how to lead others through them safely. Morrison selected his team carefully. Corporal Jenkins, a steady communications specialist, Private Martinez, an expert marksman, Specialist Thompson, a combat engineer, and Private Johnson, the youngest member of the unit who had always looked up to Morrison as a mentor. Each soldier brought specific skills that would be crucial for the mission's success. "Listen carefully," Morrison briefed his team quietly, away from Rodriguez's hearing. "This isn't about proving anything to anyone. This is about completing the mission safely and bringing everyone home. We're going to use everything I've learned over the years, not to show off, but to protect each other." As the team prepared to move out, Rodriguez watched with satisfaction. He had convinced himself that Morrison would finally fail, that leading other soldiers would expose the veteran's limitations, and that this would restore the proper balance of authority within the unit. What Rodriguez didn't anticipate was that Morrison's years of combat experience had taught him something far more valuable than individual tactical skills. He had learned how to bring out the best in other soldiers, how to build trust under pressure, and how to make life-or-death decisions that prioritized people over politics. Morrison led his team through the desert using a route that avoided the obvious paths Rodriguez expected them to take. Instead of rushing toward the objective to meet the tight timeline, Morrison spent time teaching his soldiers how to read the terrain, how to move silently across different surfaces, and how to communicate without radio equipment using hand signals and environmental cues. "Why are we going so slow, Sarge?" Private Johnson whispered during a brief rest stop. "Speed without purpose gets people killed," Morrison replied quietly. "We're not racing against the clock, son. We're moving with intention. Every step we take is designed to give us an advantage when we reach the objective." Morrison was teaching his team the same lessons he had learned through years of surviving impossible situations. He showed them how to use shadows for concealment, how to identify the safest routes through dangerous terrain, and most importantly, how to think like a team rather than individual soldiers following orders. When they finally reached the objective, Morrison's team was not tired and stressed from rushing across the desert. They were focused, confident, and working together like a unit that had been training together for months rather than hours. Rodriguez's time pressure had become irrelevant because Morrison had transformed the mission from a race against time into a methodical demonstration of professional soldiering. The assault on the fortified compound was textbook perfect, but not because Morrison followed the textbook. Instead, he had taught his soldiers to adapt the textbook to real-world conditions. They approached the target using techniques that prioritized safety over speed, communication over individual heroics, and teamwork over personal glory. Specialist Thompson disabled the security systems with precision. Corporal Jenkins coordinated the team's movements without radio communication, using the hand signals Morrison had taught them. Private Martinez provided overwatch with the patience of a veteran sniper. And Private Johnson, following Morrison's example, focused on protecting his teammates rather than trying to impress anyone. The entire operation was completed in 90 minutes, 30 minutes ahead of Rodriguez's deadline, with 0 casualties and complete mission success. But the real achievement wasn't the tactical success. It was the transformation of 4 individual soldiers into a cohesive team under Morrison's leadership. When the team returned to base, Rodriguez was waiting with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He had spent the past 2 hours convincing himself that Morrison would finally fail, that the pressure of leading others would expose his limitations, and that this would vindicate the captain's leadership philosophy. Instead, Rodriguez watched in growing dismay as Morrison's team returned not just successful but visibly changed by their experience. The soldiers carried themselves differently, with more confidence, more professionalism, and more respect for each other. They had experienced real leadership, and the contrast with Rodriguez's command-by-intimidation approach was impossible to ignore. "Mission accomplished, sir," Morrison reported simply, handing over the materials they had secured from the objective. Rodriguez examined the results with a sinking heart. Not only had Morrison succeeded again, but he had done so while training other soldiers to succeed as well. The captain realized that he had not trapped Morrison. He had provided the veteran with a platform to demonstrate the kind of leadership that Rodriguez had never learned in any military academy. The other soldiers gathered around Morrison's team, eager to hear about their mission. But instead of boasting about their success, Morrison directed attention to his team members' individual contributions. He praised Thompson's technical skills, Jenkins's communication abilities, Martinez's marksmanship, and Johnson's courage under pressure. Rodriguez watched this display of genuine leadership with growing understanding of how completely he had misunderstood Morrison from the beginning. The veteran wasn't trying to undermine the captain's authority. He was simply demonstrating what real leadership looked like. That evening, as the exercise officially concluded, Rodriguez faced the most difficult moment of his military career. He could continue down the path of ego and resentment, or he could admit that he had learned something valuable from a subordinate. The decision came when he found Morrison alone, cleaning his equipment in preparation for the return to base. "Sergeant Morrison," Rodriguez began, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "Yes, sir?" Rodriguez struggled with words he had never expected to say. "I owe you an apology and an explanation." Morrison looked up from his equipment, his expression unchanged. "Sir? This week, the missions I gave you, I was trying to prove that rank and education were more important than experience. I was trying to put you in your place because I felt threatened by the respect you command from the soldiers." Morrison listened without interrupting, neither gloating over the captain's admission nor making the moment more difficult than it already was. "The truth is," Rodriguez continued, "I've been so focused on being in command that I never learned how to actually lead. Watching you this week, the way you handle impossible situations, the way you develop other soldiers, the way you put the mission and the people before your own ego, I realize I've been doing this job all wrong." Morrison finally spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Captain, leadership isn't about proving you're the smartest person in the room. It's about making everyone around you better than they thought they could be. Rank gives you authority, but respect has to be earned through your actions." Rodriguez nodded, feeling the weight of lessons he should have learned years ago. "Would you be willing to teach me? Not officially, not in a way that undermines the chain of command, but would you help me become the kind of leader my soldiers deserve?" Morrison's response came without hesitation. "Sir, that's what good soldiers do for each other. We help each other become better." Over the following months, Rodriguez underwent a transformation that surprised everyone who knew him. Under Morrison's quiet guidance, he learned to listen before speaking, to consider the human cost of every decision, and to measure success not by personal advancement but by the development of his soldiers. The captain discovered that Morrison's Silencio approach to leadership was not about being quiet, it was about being thoughtful. The veteran's silence was not submission, but wisdom, choosing when to speak and when to listen, when to lead from the front and when to support from behind. Morrison never asked for recognition for his role in Rodriguez's transformation. He continued to serve quietly and professionally, training soldiers and completing missions with the same dedication he had always shown. But those who served with both men during that period understood that they had witnessed something rare, a moment when ego gave way to wisdom, when rank surrendered to respect, and when a captain learned that true authority comes not from the bars on your shoulders, but from the trust you build with those you lead. Years later, when Rodriguez had earned his promotion to major through genuine leadership rather than political maneuvering, he would often reflect on the week that changed his life. Operation Desert Storm had been designed to showcase his tactical brilliance, but it had instead taught him the most important lesson of his career, that the best leaders are often those who lead so quietly that others never realize they're being led at all. Morrison's legacy lived on in every soldier Rodriguez trained, using the principles the veteran had taught him. The Silencio 7 mission, originally designed as an impossible trap, became a story passed down through the ranks, not as a tale of how a captain was brought low, but as an example of how true leadership can emerge from the most unlikely places and transform everyone it touches. In the end, Rodriguez learned that Morrison had never been trying to outsmart him. The veteran had simply been trying to serve his country, protect his fellow soldiers, and uphold the values that make military service a calling rather than just a job. And in teaching those lessons to a prideful young captain, Morrison had accomplished a mission far more important than any exercise or deployment. He had helped create a leader worthy of the soldiers he commanded.